Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Craft Politics. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
Hi, and I'm Andrew Percy. So I'm going to take the lead today then, Joseph, because normally Joseph likes the sound of his own voice so much that he tries to introduce everybody, but I get the honour today. So it's a really great pleasure. We've got Dan Hannan joining us, Lord Hannan, member of the House of Lords, former member of the European Parliament for South East England. In fact, at one point, Dan, I think you were the only Conservative MEP elected, weren't you?
Yeah, the 2019 European election was our lowest moment as a party in nearly 4 centuries of existence. We went down to 8.8% in the poll, but I managed to do a little bit better than that in my region. I say our lowest moment, of course. We don't know how low it's going to go.
Oh, well, we'll come on to that in a moment. But anyway, Dan was served until we left the European Union, made a member of the House of Lords in 2021. Dan was an MEP, regular contributor to newspapers, but also particularly on Fox News, we always seem to see you. One of the founders of Vote Leave, obviously a strong advocate for Brexit, a strong advocate for free trade, well-known commentator on conservative politics, an avowed Atlanticist, and importantly, somebody who knows Canadian politics inside out. And I think it was a 2023 conservative convention in Quebec City, where Dan made an address to the Conservative convention ahead of the election, which we thought would eventually lead to the removal of Trudeau. It kind of did, but unfortunately Trudeau went, and the rest is history, as they say. But anyway, really great to have you with us, Dan, today. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Joseph. Nice to meet you.
So what I thought, I wanted to do really, Dan, because you know conservative politics kind of inside out, particularly across the, you're an Atlanticist, you are somebody who understands the Anglosphere, is, committed to those links across the Anglosphere. So I just want to do a quick canter through, where are we at when it comes to conservative parties and conservative politics in the Anglosphere? Because obviously we were all expecting a great conservative victory here in Canada earlier this year. Didn't come to pass despite the very strong showing of the Conservatives. We've discussed many times where the Conservative Party in the UK is at the moment. The Liberal Party, our sister party in Australia, seems to be in a pretty difficult position. And of course, in the US, whilst conservatism seems to be on the march, it's a different kind of brand of conservatism to what many of us in the Tory party, either here in Canada or in the UK, would understand. So I just want to take a quick canter through of, is conservative politics, traditional conservative politics, on the march, or are we in retreat?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the central fact in modern politics is the lockdown and the response to it. I think the lockdown flicked switches in people's brains and created a much more authoritarian mood and engendered demand for the smack of firm government. I think it has left us in a much more statist atmosphere than we were in before, and fundamentally altered the relationship between state and citizen. And we've seen, if you like, a retreat of individualist, property-based, sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite conservatism, as we've seen a retreat of small government thinking in general in response to that massive extension of state power. Now, in the US, the transition or the transformation has been within a party. I don't think Donald Trump would have been recognizable to a Republican of the 80s and 90s. Yes, there was always a constituency in the GOP that was nativist and protectionist and wanted to kind of mobilize the state against people it didn't like. But that was never the predominant tendency until now. In Britain, slightly different situation. The Conservative Party is being squeezed by a party that isn't exactly MAGA, that I think has better tendencies than MAGA has and more liberal tendencies, but that is nonetheless tapping in to a lot of the same concerns that the core Trump vote has. Canada was actually the place that I was most enthusiastic about, and Canadian conservatism was the brand that I felt was the one likeliest to deliver, because yes, I think, of course, Canada was subject to the same cultural trends as the rest of us, and the truckers' convoy and the anti-vax movement and all of those things. But I think the Canadian Tories had managed to kind of ride those things without losing their belief in personal freedom and constitutional propriety. And if I can put it this way, without ever descending into the hysteria that you get in a lot of other democracies at the moment, it is very normal to hear American friends on both sides of the aisle saying, if the other guys win, there'll never be a free election again. I do occasionally hear Canadians say that, but it kind of sounds like a lunatic thing to say.
Nobody really believes it, right?
Right. And that, by the way, that is no small thing at the moment, to have retained that sense of political normality, that the other party are your opponents and not your enemies. That is a great prize right now. So, of course, I was hugely disappointed by what happened at the Canadian general election. I don't think anyone had seen it coming. But I'm afraid that one of the impacts of Trump is that he is systematically hollowing out the center-right everywhere else. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum is on 85% approval ratings. If you were a pro-American Mexican politician, you're finished now. I'm off to Iceland next week, where there is now the government is proposing a referendum on reopening negotiations with the EU. Now, that was a dead issue in Iceland, right? I mean, that was just a complaint. No one in Iceland was talking about joining the EU until the threats of annexation against Greenland. Imagine 5 years ago having this conversation that Iceland would be worried about being invaded by the United States, right? We'd be worried about being annexed. I mean, it's an incredible thing I mean, you might say that that's an exaggerated fear, but there's no question that it is driving politics there. And so, yeah, I do think politics has become badly disordered in the US, and preserving the sanity and the civility of Canadian politics is no small prize.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're kind of in that, we're back to the old Cold War where you've got aggressive Russia and, America, reasserting itself. But but back in the Cold War, America reasserted itself as our defender, whereas now we don't know whether America is reasserting itself as our friend or our foe. It's really fascinating. And, if you think back to the 80s, where conservatives in the UK and in Canada took a lot of their inspiration from the US, and that, arguably helped conservative movements to win elections, the kind of sharing of ideas across the Atlantic, the Thatcher-Reagan dynamic. Conservative parties now, what's your view in terms of, should we be looking to take anything from the MAGA movement? Is there anything from the Trump phenomenon? Because Joseph and I have talked about Trump quite a lot. It's kind of we always find it really frustrating because he's not wrong about everything, right? He often identifies the problem, but then comes up with a kind of the wrong solution or just a crazy solution. Is there anything conservative parties, particularly those that, if you think in Canada, very good result, but unable to win, the UK, Australia, is there anything we should be looking to take from that movement? Or is electoral success, in the direction of going in the opposite,
Yeah.
So,
of course, Trump is not wrong about everything, right? I mean, I believe that Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing. I've seen it in people. Right. But equally, so is Trump derangement a real thing. I've seen it in him. Trump derangement syndrome may be a perfectly rational response to it. But look, of course he's getting some things right. Sorting out the border crisis, good for him, right? The deregulation, the tax cut, good for him. However, this is in a context where he is abandoning everything that made the post-war order relatively stable and prosperous and comfortable, relative, that is, to the pre-war order and everything that had gone before, right? We live in a world that was created off Newfoundland in August 1941. Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter committed us to a number of precepts that then became the war aims of the Western Allies in the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, and then became effectively the NATO war aims. And then after the end of the Cold War became, if you like, the established framework for international relations. The idea that you should prefer democracy to dictatorship. The idea that you shouldn't help yourself to a slice of a neighboring country just because you could. The idea that not just diplomatic legations, but borders were inviolable and that there would be consequences. And also the idea of global free trade, the idea of open sea lanes. All of these things worked extremely well and raised the human race to a pinnacle of happiness and freedom. And that's what's now been abandoned. And I really do feel that this is the single biggest challenge for conservatives everywhere. How do we respond to the country on which that order had rested now turning against it? The Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, is qualitatively different from almost every other post-1945 conflict in that it is a naked grab for territory on which one of the parties had no claim at all. Donbass was not a disputed area that the maps showed differently in two countries. It was just a straightforward pre-1940 type, I can do this, so I will. And that should have triggered an extraordinary and immediate condemnation and reaction by everybody else. Instead of which, we had from the US, well, if you can do that, then we'll have Greenland. And actually, why not Panama and maybe Canada and Gaza? And that is suddenly, we're in a really, really scary place. And the essence of conservatism is clinging on to good things that we love, to our nations, our laws, our institutions. Well, it is difficult to cling on to that international order when the country on which it rested has ceased to apply it. And that, I think, is the single biggest challenge we all have.
Yeah, and I mean, it was conservatives who were most wedded to that vision of the world. It was very much it was the left were the people we used to think were the ones who were, occasionally, depending on their formation at any particular time, not committed. It was very much seemed like it was a conservative vision that, and that tying to institutions to just, was an innate conservative thing. And that's just not where we are now. And I suppose but then it's also not where the electorate is it? So, it's how do conservative parties in the West, because, this is, of course, we've talked about many times, happening not just across the Anglosphere, but it's happening across the, the Western world. It's happening with the CDU. Look at what's happened to the Republicans. So, the electorate doesn't seem to be in that position. The electorate seems to almost resent the world that we formed post-war, which has given humans the highest level of wealth, health, access to education, social welfare, ever existing in the entire existence of humans on this planet. But yet so much of the public seems really angry about that.
You can now say that because you were an ex-MP, and I can now say that because I don't need to worry about the electorate either. But yes, let's come out and say it. That we are an ungrateful generation who are being inexcusably blasé about the inheritance that we've been privileged to get from people who really had to suffer and fight to give it to us. What was that Edmund Burke observation that rage and frenzy will tear down in half an hour what prudence builds up over centuries, yes. Right? There is something petulant about saying, well, here is this or that imperfection. So let's, disregard the entire capitalist order. Let's disregard the whole international order that preserved peace among countries. I mean, and Trump, of course, is the embodiment of that, right? He's the perfect instrument of the toddler petulant instinct. To be fair, I think this has always been a difference between British Toryism and American republicanism. British Toryism is in the most exact way more conservative. It's the difference between Edmund Burke and Tom Paine. Tom Paine is regularly cited by, even before the MAGA madness, Paine was always being cited by American Republican friends. I can't think of any British Tory who would see him as other than on the other side. And so there was always this slight difference between a British Tory party that was more hierarchical, if you like, more in favor of authority and more in hoc to institutions and to the legitimacy that is bestowed by antiquity, and a more radical American right that was anti-elitist and ready to tear things up and start all over again. But never to this extent, and never in this way, at least not in recent memory. Again, I think Canada actually got this right. Canada was able to ride those two. The Canadian Tories, at least since Stephen Harper, or at least since the merger, have got that almost exactly right, because they were heirs to both a radical and a conservative tradition, and that was electorally very potent. But more important, was actually very good in government, because they had the ability to change what needed changing without wanting to rip everything up in the way that you get from the MAGA people.
And I remember when you spoke to the Conservative Convention back in 2023, you had, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I were to, my memory of it was very much you talking about the need for Canadians to be proud of what we built, to be proud of, even as imperfect as they are as humans, but be proud of the nation builders that have come before us. And you had positioned that at a time when I would say sort of a frustration with Justin Trudeau, wokeism in Canada was probably hitting its penultimate high. And I find it interesting that since you delivered that speech, we're now at a place where, as a reaction to the threats that we are receiving via the Trump tariff war, that we've had this rally around the flag moment, elbows up. Canadians now understand that we actually should be proud and we should be looking after ourselves and building up our institutions again. We're now talking about big nation building projects. I'm curious what your reaction is to that. Was that inevitable? Is it, I mean, I don't want us to sit here and wax on about how right we are.
That is such an interesting question, right? So I think that in his heart, Carney was basically coming from the same place that Trudeau was. States are anachronistic, a bit embarrassing, fine opium for the masses, but not
a bit racist.
Yeah, a bit really not something, but he's not an idiot, and he's aware of the vibe shift, and so he took the opportunity, I think, to distance himself from the more extreme kind of, post-national Trudeaupianism. But it's a really good question as to where does this end? I mean, one of the fascinating things about the whole elbows up movement is I've always been a huge exponent of Kanzuk. I mean, I think Kanzuk, the idea of a closer union commercially in terms of military defense and security, and above all, free movement of labor between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, is about the best idea and the most popular idea that's out there and that hasn't yet happened. Campaign born in Vancouver, by the way, at least in its modern form. But here's an interesting thought that occurred to me the other day. I wonder whether we might not get a lefty version of Kanzuk triggered by Trump. Yeah. And what I mean by that is I think Carney likes both the intellectual positioning and the electoral positioning of being the kind of grown-up leader of the free world, in contradistinction to the kind of out-of-control US president. And I think that both Keir Starmer and Anthony Albanese will kind of share that inclination. And so we may end up with a different kind of Kanzuk, which will have elements that I would like. I mean, I think it'll be pro-free trade. I think it'll be pro-rule of law, against Russia taking over other countries because it can, or the most horrible thing about MAGA, against, Ukraine kind of had it coming because Zelensky had something to do with the impeachment. But equally, there'll be stuff that we don't like. It'll be very green, I suspect. It'll be very, very pro-net zero. It'll be quite woke. It'll be quite, DEI. It will be quite pro-immigration and very pro-supranationalism, very pro-UN and all that. So I reckon that's a price worth paying to give Kanzuk appeal on both sides of the aisle. But you never see how these things are going to work. Kanzuk is a popular idea, right? When you poll people in any part of the four countries, including in French Canada, it always polls incredibly well. Eventually, one politician or another is going to turn and swim with that current. Why not the Liberals? It would be one of the genuinely popular, successful things they could do.
It's interesting. I mean, it made it into the Conservative platform, didn't it? But just as
the Liberal platform.
And the Liberal platform. It's really interesting. Now, we'll come to Brexit maybe a little bit later, but just the one pushback you often get on the Kanzuk thing, because obviously, natural advocate here in Vancouver. I should have mentioned at the introduction that Dan's neighbour, almost neighbour, is indeed the groover from Vancouver, right? So, I'm sure that you and Brian are talking about Vancouver all the time.
I mean, on a quiet day in this little corner of Hampshire, you can hear him practicing his guitar virtually. That's how close he is.
It's a beautiful image of like rural England. That's been of the old conservative England. We'll come on to Brexit a bit later, but we sometimes get criticised as being hypocrites, right, for saying we don't want free movement with the EU, but actually we want free movement with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So how do you respond to that because that's something that's often thrown at us when you say you're in favour of Kanzuk?
Yes, and it's a bad faith argument, because I can't believe people don't really know the answer to that. British people can imagine themselves taking advantage of that free movement, as and Kiwis and Canadians.
Exactly.
So almost everyone in this country can imagine that they or their children or grandchildren or whatever might want to work for a while in Melbourne or in Auckland or in Vancouver, and one here's the same thing in all of those places. Almost nobody here imagines that they're going to go and work in Riga or in Bucharest. And so the EU free movement was a completely one-way thing. Because of the disparity of GDP per head, and because of the asymmetry of languages, because English is a commonly taught second language, but Latvian and so on are not. It was an overwhelmingly one-way movement of people. It's interesting when people are sure you've heard this in Canada. We get it a lot in Britain. There's a sort of performative anti-racism. It's the only way in which people try and make the argument against Kanzuk. Oh, what is it about these white dominions? And yet, if you look at if you look at the actual data, all of the Kanzuk countries, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all have much higher proportions of non-white citizens than the EU has. This is really, this is fundamentally about interoperability. Interoperability of economic regulations, interoperability of professional qualifications. If you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you're an architect, you haven't just studied the same kind of syllabus. You've probably studied at the same institutions. And so we have this ability to collaborate, which even after 50 years of EU membership, we really didn't have with Belgium or with Italy or whatever. That's one of those things. There should be a special word for this. It's one of those things that everybody knows, but the media theatrically pretend not to understand.
Yeah, I mean, and throughout our entire membership of the European Union as well, you look at where the number one destinations for British emigrants were. So people leaving the UK, take Spain out of it because that tended to be, slightly older people going to retire. The top destinations were all English-speaking countries for Brits choosing to go and live overseas, right? It was Canada, it was the US.
Sorry, you don't even need to take Spain out of it. There are more Brits, and there were at the time of Brexit, more Brits living just in Australia than in the whole of the EU.
Yes, but it just seems to me. But I like the idea that we'll end up with, because of Donald Trump. Trump might be our biggest advocate for Kanzuk at the end of the day. Then, so I quite enjoy that. Now,
to hold the door open one day to the US coming in and being the fifth member, it's the obvious thing to happen.
Right.
But actually, I think the way for it to happen, from everyone's point of view, is for Kanzuk to get going first, so that it isn't. It isn't a star and then 4 satellite planets, that it's much more an alliance of equals.
Yeah, 100%. I want to come to Brexit probably at the end, but go back to British politics now. It's just, Joseph will have to close his ears, but there just seems to be so much more happens in British politics than in Canadian politics, particularly at the moment. So I think, Dan, you told us before we started, you're about to write the history of Toryism, right? Of the Tory party, which has not been done before, I think you said, in terms of the work of that kind. And something you'd written really struck me about the British Tories, obviously the British Conservatives, was that their existence predates the title of Prime Minister, predates cabinet government, and of course even predates the existence of the very country of the United Kingdom and its current formation, which is just a fascinating thing. We all know, as British Conservatives, it's the world's most successful democratic party. No government's won more elections, was in power for, I think, 2/3 of the 20th. Presently, though, between 15 and 20% in the opinion polls, having, got 24% in the 2024 general election. Everybody, we've talked a lot here also about the mess in the Labour Party, also down to sub 20%. Ordinarily, that would be great news for the British Conservatives. It isn't. So, is the British Conservative Party dead? What's the way back for it?
So all very interesting points. Yes, I mean, I think this is our worst moment in terms of kind of our national performance since the 1760s. One of the things about being an old party is that we think in centuries.
Centuries, yeah.
I mean, I just want to dwell for a second, because I just think it's such a cool point and such an underexplored and underappreciated point. How incredible that 1680s and 1690s, we had a modern, functioning two-party system where the militants of the two parties would wear differently coloured rosettes, would campaign and fundraise for marginal constituencies, would read partisan newspapers, would form clubs in different places, and were not just a faction around a leader, but were based on a set of principles. I mean, that's a truly extraordinary fact. The second oldest party in the world is the US Democratic Party, starting in 1828. And even if you trace its roots back to Jefferson, it's still a century younger. So amazing that one of those two parties is still in business. And I as you were kind enough to say no one's written this, but every previous history of the Conservative Party stops or starts. There's a canyon from about 1760 to the 1780s where the party structure disappears, but Toryism does not, and nobody's ever written the whole story before. So here's what I think with that lengthy history in mind, and just a little cautionary note not to underestimate a very old institution. There is only really space in our electoral system or yours, really, for two big parties. If there is an even split on either side, that is electorally cataclysmic. And the Canadian viewers will know that better than the British ones, right? Because you lived through it after the 1993 election, and Canada had a lengthy period of Liberal rule with a quite small and dwindling vote share because competing centre-right candidates were fighting in every riding. Now, Nigel Farage, who was elected on the same day as me and in the same region as me, we served together in the European Parliament for 21 years, left on the same day. I know that he was obsessed with that story, obsessed with the 1993 election. It is not insignificant that he called his party Reform. That was not a coincidence.
Absolutely. Really?
And absolutely right. No, he had Preston Manning at his most recent conference, giving him his kind of benediction, right? Great man, Preston Manning, a huge fan. And so this, I think, is what Nigel would like to happen. He sees this as being a little bit like what happened after 1993, where Reform becomes the main party. The Tories have to fall in behind it. And then he will be the Stephen Harper figure who comes from Reform to become leader of some kind of merged party on the right and prime minister. And I'm not sure that's not an unrealistic prospect, right? That may well be what happens. But there are some real downsides. And the particular downside is how long, it took you guys a decade, right? We really want another decade of Labour government. So
I don't think Labour wants another decade of Labour government.
Literally if you speak to any of these Labour people privately, I mean, you will know, Andrew, civilians never really believe the extent to which politicians talk frankly to people in other parties. They're almost the only people you can talk frankly to, more easily in some ways than the guys on our own side. But the Labour people will tell you quite openly, if you guys ever get your act together, we are toast, meaning conservatism and reform. So I think the best prospect for the British right is to try and truncate that process, to try and get some kind of winning majority in place. Now, I'm not arguing for a coalition. I'm not arguing for a merger. I mean, that may happen down the line, but it's obviously not going to happen in the short term because so many Reform voters are driven by disappointment with the last Tory government, perfectly understandably. But what I am arguing for is a grown-up agreement not to stand candidates in the seats that you can't win, right? Which I really don't think is much to ask. And the electoral geography of the UK makes this actually incredibly easy. We have very complementary electorates. Our two manifestos are very similar, or at least by the next election will be. I think it is almost inconceivable that the two rightist parties will not go into the next election against net zero, against the European Convention, for tax cuts, for strong defence, for strong borders, etc. In fact, I'm willing to predict now that if we were to do this during the run-up to the next election, and I were to read you passages from the two manifestos, whatever they are by then, you would not be able to guess which was which.
Which is which.
But although the policies are very similar, the ambience, the mood, the gestalt, if I want to be pretentious, is very different. And the geography is very different. In basic terms, my party is strong in the south of England. Reform is strong in the north of England and in Wales. And in fact, even in Scotland, we are strong in the borders in the northeast. Reform is strong in the cities. Bits of the UK where we're really in direct competition is kind of where you were, actually, Andrew. So there's a strip down the east of England, right? And even there, it's kind of pretty obvious who would stand aside. So if we were to do this at the next election, I think it would be a guaranteed right of centre government. Now, is that going to happen? I wouldn't rule it out. So if this were entirely a question of logic, if we were all Dr. Spock from Star Trek, we'd have done this by now. It's kind of such an obvious thing to do, right? But of course, we're human beings, and egos get in the way, and ambitions get in the way, and people are prone to optimism bias, and especially when you have two competing parties on one side, very often people defect from one to the other because of push rather than pull migration. So they are resented by the people, they've left because they fell out with their colleagues. All of that stands in the way. Nonetheless, I think there is a chance of this happening for this reason. Reform is talking, encouragingly, about making huge and qualitative changes to how we are governed, to tackling the overmighty administrative state, which is the root cause of the migration and crisis and the growth crisis and almost everything else. In order to do that, in order to do all the things that they are talking about, completely transforming the civil service, the judiciary, etc., they will need not just a majority, but a mandate. I don't think they will be able to tackle a task of the magnitude that they have set themselves if they are in the same position as Keir Starmer is in now, where, yes, they have a parliamentary majority, but on, 34% of the vote or whatever, which is what Labour did for the last election. So I think there is, from that point of view, a case, even from the self-interested point of view of Nigel Farage, for some kind of deal. And just to tie it in finally to where we started with the long history of the Tory party, it may well be that at the end of this process, there is some new legal entity, just as in Canada, that there is a merger of, there'll be a Conservative, I mean, you went through all those various names of the alliance and all that, right? Something similar may happen. But if I say Tory now to a Canadian, everyone knows what that means, right? Yeah. And if you speak, as I did to a number of the party activists when at your convention in Quebec City, if you say, when was your party founded? They don't say 2011. It's like 1867, right? It's the old party. So Toryism is going to survive, I suspect, in Britain under whatever legal format.
I wonder if the difference, though, Dan, is that, in the Canadian context, we had to suffer through some serious, the old PC party, the old Progressive Conservative Party, had to suffer through a bunch of pretty difficult election cycles in which it became very clear that the Reform Party of Canada was going nowhere. Like it was around. And I wonder if this time the difference, at least on the UK, is that reform, if I put myself in Tory shoes, we have all this institutional history. We have this brand that's been around for centuries. This reform thing might just be a little blip. It's not real. It hasn't borne out itself. And I wonder if, unfortunately, the UK party the UK Tories need to have this moment where reform performs very well at the next vote, and it maybe performs again at the one after that before it finally goes, okay, this is permanent. The electorate's been reshaped around these new boundaries, and we have to come together. Do you think there's any possibility that in advance of a vote that there's just coming together?
Yes.
Because it seems like it's a bit of a gamble, isn't it?
There is a possibility. I mean, of course, you're right. There are people who say that. Unlike after 1993, we are a party with 120 MPs. They are a party with 5. A party with 120 MPs does not volunteer to be taken over by a party of 5 in the way that a party with 2 MPs might. But I actually think that the greater resistance is on the other side. Everyone has to say, oh, we're not talking about a pact. Of course, we're 4 years out potentially from an election, so everyone's going to say that now. But I think most Conservatives, including Conservatives who are not particularly on the right, understand the electoral geography. I think the much bigger challenge is the people in Reform who say, our voters are backing us to get away from all of that. Why would we tarnish our brand by going in with these kind of losers? I mean, I've already given my answer to that. If you want a mandate, you're not going to get it on your own. But also, like I say, it's not a question. I'm not suggesting that we merge. I'm just suggesting that each party focuses on the seats that it can realistically win. And I think to that degree, there is some similarity with Canada, that you do have regional bases for, in different electorates. But if anything, it's more pronounced here than it was then.
Yeah, I just there's two, I suppose, pushbacks on that is, in Canada, it took both parties a couple of electoral cycles, as you've outlined, to finally see that, look, the only way we can actually win power here is if we actually merge, if we actually come to an arrangement, the alliance and all the rest of it. If you're Reform at the moment, though, and you're looking at some of these polls, the last MRP poll by YouGov had them on, I think, winning 311 seats. So they're very close to winning a majority without the Conservatives, knowing full well that in that situation, and there's, say, 40, 50 Tories survive, the 40, 50 Tories are going to have nowhere to go. I suppose the thing is, first question is, one, do reform really have the incentive to work with the Tories, given that the polling seems to show they could potentially, and they seem to be, they're tacking upwards and the Tories are tracking downwards. So they might very well get there without the need for a merger. And secondly, my second kind of question is, we have a wing of the Conservative Party. I always consider myself right smack bang in the middle of the Conservative Party, so I didn't really associate with either wing. You just get painted as a right winger because you were pro-Brexit, right? But we have a wing of the Conservative Party that, when we were in government with a majority of 80, absolutely prevented us from doing some of those big changes, which when I look back now, I'm embarrassed we never made, right? We never tackled the institutional biases. We couldn't tackle the migration issue because we had colleagues who were not prepared to even countenance the debate over the ECHR. We had a whole string of MPs on that particular wing of the party who seemed to revel in actually pushing back on anything we did that was seen as, an attack on the institutions, whether it was the judiciary, whether it was the way policing was undertaken. As I said, the ECHR, international institutions, all these things, which seem to, screw us, frankly, in blunt terms, from actually dealing with many of the things that my constituents used to be really angry about. So, with Reform possibly winning on their own, that wing of the Tory party that seems to be repulsed by any kind of talk of institutions not being fit for purpose. Realistically, does that mean that?
I think wing makes them sound much more numerous than they are.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people say what you've just said, and particularly a lot of Reform supporters say, "Oh, you're all Lib Dems in disguise, and you all love the ECHR." And so on. I mean, this is the party that put the parliamentary party that put Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick in the final. I mean, that doesn't seem to me a wet electorate of MPs, let alone the members who are much more hardline. So when I say to people, who are these Lib Dems? They name the sort of, 4 or 5 obvious ones that we can all name, and then they run out. And actually, I just think that those people, because the TV editors loved them, gave an impression of being much more numerous. So yes, there may be a few people who say, over my dead body, fine, just as there were a few PCs in Canada who wouldn't go along with the merger, but they were very few. They are very few. I think that the first bit of what you were saying is the more interesting, right? What's in it for Reform if they think they can win anyway? Well, like I say, I think the main answer to that is because you need a mandate, not just a bare majority. But I think there's a couple of other things to bear in mind. At the most recent Reform conference, Nigel was talking about the experience gap. And he was quite frank about this. He said, look, our biggest weakness is not having people who have dealt with government. And I think, again, if you want to do these massive institutional changes, repealing the whole Blair juridical settlement, taking out the Supreme Court, it is very helpful to have a bunch of people who have been there, know their way around Whitehall, know the tricks that the civil servants use, all of that. And I think actually Nigel Farage is much more aware of that, much more cognizant of that than most of his activists are. The second point for him, or third point if you're counting the mandate one, he knows that he is struggling to fill 650 candidacies in every constituency with top people. I mean, this is no reflection on him. This is every new party has this problem. Being able to focus on the 350 winnable, on a good day seats, even if you believe the current polls, and award them all of that. That is that's a much more achievable task, and he will end up then with a higher caliber of parliamentary party.
Yeah, I see all that. I think the credibility gap and the kind of skills gap they have is the one that I think is the biggest risk for the right generally, right? Because assuming we end up with a centre-right government after the next election in the UK, in whatever formation it is, if things, if the polling is as it is and stays as it is, that would be the case. But so I've been to get your perspective on this, because I see that a high risk for any kind of reform-led government is exactly as you've highlighted, right? Is they don't know their way around the institution. There will be such institutional pushback, the use of judicial review, the activism of judges, the House of Lords, the chamber you sit in. Because I wrote a piece on this only a few weeks ago saying that, if I was reform right now, I wouldn't be belly aching about reform Lords. I'd be belly aching about reform of the Lords. because as we saw in government, even when we had, hundreds of members of the House of Lords who were nominally Conservatives, I mean, you may have some views as to how many of the Conservative peers are actually Conservative, but, they're going to need a plan from day one to deal with the judiciary, with the civil service, but particularly with the House of Lords, right? Because, they're going to have a very aggressive legislative agenda. And how can they possibly do that with our House of Lords, which is packed against them? And I just think this is the biggest risk to them, is this kind of, if they don't have on day one a plan on how they're going to deal with some of this, then we'll end up with what we ended up with Boris, right? Where it's a lot of public expectation, people who voted for the first time, voted for the kind of a right-wing party for the first time, who end up just being ultimately thoroughly disappointed as the system continues, the establishment continues to get what it wants, right? Which is to frustrate anything that's seen as mildly, radical.
I agree. And look, I don't even think the Lords is the worst of it.
Judicial.
On the Lords, that is one of the few areas where there really is a policy difference between the two. And this is what I mean when I say it's really a mood or a tonal more than a practical difference. It is the difference between conservatism being literally that, wanting to preserve institutions and reform, starting from the position that the system has failed and needs to be torn up. So really the only big differences I can see still being in place at the next election are on things like scrapping the House of Lords or changing our voting system, both of which are at the moment, as far as I understand, reform policies. Funnily enough, I'm closer to reform than to my own party on both of those. I think our voting
Me too.
quite hard to justify. But I don't see why that would be a deal breaker in a coalition if there were one, because it is precisely those constitutional questions that you should put to a referendum. And I think both sides would see that. But I don't think the Lords is going to be the biggest challenge for them. You were, I think, still in Parliament, Andrew, when we had the extraordinary way in which the Court of Appeal overturned the government's migration policy, the centerpiece of it, the Rwanda scheme. And there was a line in the Court of Appeal's ruling, which I thought was incredibly telling and deeply alarming from a democratic point of view, where in the judgment, they said to general principles of international law. Now, there's no such thing as general principles of international law. They were just making that up. And it was their way of saying, I think, look, even if you pull out of the ECHR, even if you pull out of the UN Convention on Refugees, even if you pull out of every other international treaty down to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we're still not going to let you do this. And that, I don't think people have properly grasped the ambition of some of these leftist judges who, see their task as a kind of, I think a lot of them began as young barristers during the Thatcherite hegemony as a kind of alternative, because they weren't going to get anywhere as Labour MPs. And they're more or less openly now ruling on the basis of what they think the law ought to say, rather than what it says, and getting around that. Right. So this is not just a question of repealing international treaties or even repealing a lot of the Blairite laws. This is a question of how do we appoint judges? How do we remove people who are legislating from the bench without giving a general power to every incoming government to fill the bench with its own supporters, right? Which I think we can all agree would be problematic. Now, I happen to think that there are ways of doing this. Our friend Douglas Carswell has written some wonderful papers about what an incoming government would have to do. He's got a paper called Milestones. My worry is exactly what you were saying. Encouraged by the tone of some of the reform leaders, a lot of the electorate think, oh, it's simple. We just get in there. It's just a question of willpower. Yeah. Well, I think they are setting themselves up for a bit of disappointment unless they've really thought through how they're going to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And, so much for no higher court than the High Court of Parliament, right? And, this was on the Rwanda policy, which is one I, wasn't the most enthusiastic of MPs in support of, because, I just, on the basis of, I thought we'll never get it through, it'll never. And, we'll raise public expectation to here, and the delivery will be significantly below what the public expect. However, it was just frustration. We had primary legislation
now being useful. Do you know what those facilities in Rwanda are now being used for? They are now taking illegal entrants to the United States.
Yes.
Right? It was totally feasible. It could have happened, had it not been sabotaged.
Yeah, by the judiciary. And of course, if we criticize the judiciary, we're accused of obviously being anti-democratic and enemies of blah, 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 blah. But it's, and we're seeing this actually, you're seeing this now throughout the criminal justice system as well, right? Where we've been some particularly egregious cases recently of people who have committed crimes in one direction, who haven't had sentences that have happened have been applied in other circumstances. And this whole, I sense it because I'm still back home very regularly, and in my old patch, I sense this whole two-tier thing is really, maybe that's to the, any future reform Conservative government's advantage, in that, in a way that certainly wasn't the case before I left. I don't think it was starting to become a case, but a large part of the electorate does now believe the criminal justice system, from the police through to the judiciary, is actually politicized and, weighted in one direction. I think that is better understood. So perhaps that gives some kind of space for quite radical change very early on in any future government.
Yeah, and people are right to think that. I got back yesterday from the US. I was in the deep south yesterday. And again, like every British politician in the US, I'm being told about free speech problems in Britain and two-tier justice in Britain, and having an Islamist mayor of London, and all the things that our American friends see on Twitter, on X. And one of the narratives that has taken hold very strongly in the US, and indeed with a lot of British people, is Labour passed a load of laws against free speech. The Tories failed to repeal those laws, and now we've lost free speech. And I think that fundamentally misdiagnoses what has happened. It is true that some stupid laws were passed, and yes, they should be repealed. I mean, obviously, the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act, so all these late Blair or Brown era stuff, of course,
which even the architects are now saying have taken on
exactly. Even Jack Straw, David Blunkett, exactly, who were men of real substance, are saying that. But if you look at the really egregious cases of the repression of free speech, cases like Graham Linehan being detained over 3 tweets in which he was rude about trannies, or Lucy Connolly actually going to prison. I still find this almost unbelievable, actually going to prison and serving, over a year behind bars over saying, yes, admittedly, an incredibly stupid and unpleasant thing, but nonetheless, words, right? They were not being prosecuted under any new legislation. Both of those cases, and the vast majority of the cases that we see that lead to these outrageous detentions, are under the 1986 Public Order Act. So here is a Thatcher-era piece of law that, for the first 3.5 decades of its existence, was never understood to mean what it now is being interpreted as meaning. It's a law against incitement, of the kind that almost every country in the world has, including the US. And incitement used to be tightly and narrowly understood. So, it had to be a question of you and me getting together and me saying to you, let's go and biff this particular person. There was a clear distinction between opinions and actual incitement. So if I said there are too many Archenlanders in Narnia, that is an opinion. I have to actually say, right, let's go and throw this particular Archenlander into the Winding Arrow River. Who's with me? For it to be incitement.
I'm with you.
That has now been utterly lost, right? That distinction has been utterly lost, and the cops have got it into their heads that anything that is thought to be offensive to protected minorities is kind of ipso facto a crime. So this is not a change in legislation. This is a change in the culture of the public sector, and particularly the College of Policing. And again, this just goes back to what we were saying earlier, right? The idea that a Reform or Tory government comes in and just passes a new law, that doesn't solve the problem. You've got to tackle this deep-rooted problem, which is a decade plus of DEI training and obsessive wokery in the police and in the judiciary and across the public sector generally, has created this mismatch between what the general public thinks and what the administrative state thinks.
100%. I keep saying 100% today. I don't know why. It must be some age thing, but couldn't agree more. When I first went into elected office, it was 24 years ago as a young city councillor, and I always remember meeting the chief constable and the chief cop then versus the last set of chief constables I had. you could not think we're members of the same police force. It was the same, it was the same police force, but just the way they spoke, the way they, but the chief cop at the very beginning seemed to be about catching criminals. By the end, it was I used to end up just in these kind of weird arguments with them around, like, shouldn't you be focusing on maybe tackling criminals as opposed to explaining to me why criminals themselves are often the victim? It just a complete, and all through. I actually had a friend of mine, and she was actually in politics for another party who joined the police, and she ended up leaving on the basis of, she said she couldn't believe how woke it had become and how, she was
let me once again
appalled
let me
by the training.
be the guy who blames the general public here, because
yeah, exactly.
I mean, of course, the general public is not mainly to blame. The police are mainly to blame, but there is a mechanism for the electorate to do something about it, which they are not making use of, and that is the existence of elected police and crime commissioners. Now, I have to accept that this policy failed, and I say that sadly because I was an early, in fact, an author of it, along with Douglas, who I was talking about earlier. And we came to this policy in the early 2000s because we could already see the beginning of that divergence between what the police thought they should be doing and what everyone else thought the police should be doing, right? So we commissioned a couple of surveys about this to explain what the problem was, and we would ask chief constables, what do you think should be your priorities? And they'd say, hiring more black police and improving relations with the gay community. And then you'd say to the people in those areas, what do you think the police? And they say, catching criminals, of course, including all the black people in those
areas. Bang up the wrong uns. That's what we always do. Bang the wrong uns up.
Being beastly to scoundrels. So, so we thought, well, why don't we try, as in the US, to create a mechanism where there is a directly elected sheriff who can set police priorities and ideally even set local sentencing guidelines if people are prepared to pay for it. And then you'd have people sort of, competing at the hustings, saying, this is what I think, should happen to shoplifters. And I will either ask you all to fund the prison places, or I will instead suggest that a shoplifter have to stand at a shopping centre with a placard saying shoplifter. I don't know what, right? But make it a democratic issue. Bring the electorate into it instead of leaving the cops to set their own priorities. Well, of course, the Raps slightly got at the legislation. The resulting officials didn't have anything like the power that I would have liked them to have had. And they were given a really crappy name. So instead of being called sheriffs, they were called police and crime commissioners, which, quite apart from being incredibly boring and kind of a commissioner is the opposite of an elected person. But it also, if you think about the syntax of it, a police and crime commissioner is responsible for crime. He's responsible for police and for crime, not for stopping crime. So terrible name. But with all of that, with all of those problems, there is still a mechanism, if people really wanted to get some powerful, independent kind of, maybe tough ex-cops themselves to stand and knock some sense into the heads of the local chief constables. And that is not happening. What we've got is, with one or two exceptions, we have got one or two good ones. I've got a very good one here as it happens, but that's unusual. In 80% of the country, the police and crime commissioners, just like the old police authorities, see it as their job to kind of defend the chief constable to the electorate rather than the other way around. And I'm afraid, cut it however you want. The problem there is that people are not using the democratic rights that they have in order to effect the change that they say they want.
It's like the chair of a school governing body, right? My job as chair of the school governing body is to support the head teacher and to support the school. And that's what you found with these police and crime commissioners, is that they've seen that their own electoral success and chances of being re-elected are tied to the performance of the chief constable and to the police force. So it's, I have no interest in calling out the failings of the police force I'm the police and crime commissioner for, because people will hold me responsible for those failures potentially. So you end up now with this really super cozy relationship. I like you, I voted for the legislation. I was all in favor of smashing the police authorities, believing that you had some direct control. But in actual fact, what we've ended up with is they just have a cozy relationship because they see themselves as inextricably tied.
Do you remember that awful case in Essex, which has been particularly, Essex police is one of the worst in the country, I think, bizarrely, when it comes to...
when you think of the electorate.
There can be no less representative police chief constable on the planet than in Essex, given who he represents. And yet when you remember the case where they went after my Telegraph colleague, Alison Pearson?
Yes.
And she had her collar felt because of an ancient tweet, which was nowhere near the definition of incitement or harassment. It was And, one sort of angry offence archaeologist had dug this up and then years afterwards complained to me. And of course, instead of telling the complainant to bugger off, they had to act on it. But what was to me absolutely unbelievable about that, I know that the Chief Constable in Essex has been problematic, as the other side likes to say, but the Police and Crime Commissioner in Essex, who is a Tory, still backed his guy, like the worst kind of trade unionist. Oh, well, we've got to think of how minorities might have seen that tweet. I mean, what is the point of having people there if that's what they see their job as being? So yes, actually, all of you in Essex watching this, why did you vote for that guy? And if you're angry about it, why didn't you stand for election and do something about it? Right? That's how the system is meant to work.
Look, Dan, I agree with the first part of that. The second part of it, encouraging people to stand for election, I was always nervous of that. I was always worried somebody better might put themselves forward locally. So I used to try and discourage that. I am going to, however, steal off you offence archaeologist and pass it off as my own. I quite like that. An offence.
I stole it from Toby Young. There's no such thing as in politics, Andrew. We're all in the business of trying to spread our ideas.
When I use it around Vancouver, nobody hopefully will have heard it before, so I shall pass it off as my own. So let's just, it's all been absolutely fascinating. We'll have to have you back because I just love this. But let's do Brexit very quickly. So it really, really boils my blood in this country, in Canada, to hear when people talk about Brexit, people will say to me, oh, it's all been such a terrible disaster, hasn't it? And I had somebody said to me, recently this was said, I heard things are pretty bad since Brexit in the UK. And it's just this perception that seems to have, because, what does the CBC take here? I think it's the BBC and the Guardian as its lead on these issues.
Was the person saying this to you in Vancouver with a bunch of zombies on every jug imaginable, just walking behind you or dead on the streets?
This slightly smug Canadian thing, Dan, which does kind of irritate me a little bit, is, sometimes Canadians look down their noses at Britain occasionally, and particularly around Brexit, and, believe there's this perfect society, as somebody who is on fentanyl literally collapses next to them into a heap. And I'm like, maybe perhaps sort this problem out before lecturing the rest of us. But anyway, I shall move on from my Jeremiads about Canada. But Brexit, just the perception here is that it's all been a terrible, terrible disaster. So give us your take.
First, bottom line, Britain has grown faster than the Eurozone since the vote. So whatever problems we have, plainly Brexit has not failed because we are better off than the countries that are still in the EU. Not all of them, but on balance. And hence the rather dishonest way in which the other side is forced to argue that it would have been even better. And hence they all have this model that they call the doppelganger Britain. This is what the growth rate would have been if we stayed. Oh, yeah, right. Come on. But I will concede we have been very slow to take advantage of the opportunities. I had underestimated the resistance of our administrative state, and I'd underestimated the change aversion and risk aversion of a lot of our politicians. Yes, we have improved our terms of trade with a number of other countries around the world. Particularly joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big deal, and I hope we can now come up with a better name for it. It was the Trans-Pacific Partnership before Trudeau. We had to call it the Comprehensive and Progressive Union. But we can come up with a better name. And it's a great, this is where the fast-growing countries are. And actually it's significant that you are in Vancouver. I think even within Canada, as within the US, you've seen a shift in finance and economic gravity from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So we are linked as we are to not just to Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, but to Malaysia and Singapore and places. We've made a very wise call being part of that. And we're the first serious country to get a serious trade deal with India. And yes, we have deregulated in a few key areas, particularly AI, where we're not subject to the sort of anti-internet rules of the EU. But these are slim pickings. Given what we could have done, it's incredibly disappointing that we didn't go further. Haven't gone further. I wouldn't. It's not over. And I think that is, yes, we were distracted by COVID. That consumed a lot of energies. Who knows what would have happened? The two things were exactly contemporaneous. So the day that Brexit took effect, 31st of January 2020, was the day that the first 2 cases of coronavirus were detected in the UK. Obviously, our economy, then like everyone else's, was affected by lockdown, and a certain kind of bad faith analyst, who can be found as much in Canada as in the UK, says, oh, look at how badly you've done. Well, yeah, I mean, the idea that this is because of a change, fairly mild change in our trade patterns, rather than paying everyone to stay home for 2 years, strikes me as a really, really dodgy form of argument. But with all of that, look, no country ever got poorer as a result of becoming independent. I still think the fundamentals are in place. That the issue is simply this: Brexit on its own didn't add or subtract a penny from our national wealth. All it did was it removed constraints and allowed us to make different choices. And our success or failure depends on what choices we make. Now, under this government, we are making some really bad choices. This government inherited, like others, a state that had been bloated by lockdown, but unlike others, has made no attempt to try and get anywhere closer to where we were in February 2020. On the contrary, has continued to spend even more, and to borrow and tax even more, and to regulate even more, give more powers to trade unions. We've made some bad choices, but the corrective is our own electorate. And during the Brexit referendum, I always used to say this: look, I would rather live in a democracy where people sometimes get things wrong, and where, in the end, we can correct it ourselves. Tony Benn, who you'll remember, great Eurosceptic and extreme left Labour MP, he used to say, I'd rather have a bad parliament than a good king, because in the end, you can then do something about it. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, it's almost as if we'd stopped making the political case for Brexit as well once we'd won the referendum. It's, kind of like people seemingly stopped making the case for Brexit, whereas the people who are on the other side never stopped making the case for Remain. So there is this polling, which seems to suggest the majority of Brits now think Brexit was a bad idea. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be polling showing a majority of Brits want to go back in, which I think is a classic British trait, right? Of, well, yeah, I don't like that, but I also don't want that either, which I think is actually just maybe or maybe that's just me as a Yorkshireman, and we like to be bolshy.
No, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. There's always what psephologists call the loser's premium, right? There is in any electorate. I mean, maybe grumpy Yorkshiremen are more numerous than others, but in any electorate, there is a bunch of people who say, I am discontented. And they are discontented with the status quo. So had the referendum gone the other way, a lot of those discontented people would have said, oh, this wasn't what we were promised, right? That's massively exaggerated, obviously, by the impact of lockdown, especially because people backed lockdown, in Britain as in other places, and people are therefore very reluctant to face up to the tax rises and price rises and so on being a consequence of the policy that they were themselves demanding. So there's an element of that. But remember that the opinion polls were against us all the way through, right? It was only the actual referendum that we won. So the opinion polls are not new. And remember also something else, which I think is always missed from this debate. After Brexit, the EU and its absurdities and its scams disappeared from our media because it was no longer our problem. So when we were in the EU, cases of corruption or of referendums being struck down or of economic collapse
or bendy bananas.
Right. These were big news because they directly impacted us. The stuff that's been happening since, the attempt to strike down Poland insisting on its national law, the economic crisis in Germany, the massive bribery scandal in the European Parliament with those briefcases of cash being handed out by Moroccans and so on. All of that, I mean, it's just not covered anymore because it's ceased to be our problem. And therefore, people are free to compare a necessarily imperfect reality with an imaginary kind of platonic alternative. In the event that there was actually a referendum, people would start focusing on the EU again. And they would look not only at the corruption and the slow growth and the fact that we've actually outperformed it, but they would look at the terms on which we were being told to go back in, that we'd have to join the euro, all that. And I have absolutely no doubt that we would win a second referendum. And the proof of that really is that despite longing with every fibre of their being to be there, this Labour government will not attempt a second referendum because they know what the outcome would be.
So no prospect of rejoin.
I mean, not who can tell what will happen in 10 years, 20 years that, there may not be an EU, but in the kind of timeline that we are dealing with, no prospect.
Dan, that's been absolutely brilliant. I've loved all of that. And just, you're just such a bright mind on all of this. So it's just great to hear. When are you going to have your history of Toryism completed? by next week after?
I've only got as far as 1683, so quite a lot. But it's a lot of fun. It's so much fun to research.
If you need anything from 2010 to 2024, I did keep some diaries. Most of it is unprintable, though, because a lot of words that are in it are not allowed in everyday use. But and some of it may be defamatory against former colleagues. But at the time, it was very cathartic. So, but happy to help on that.
Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Look, we'll have to have you on again if you will make time for us. Really appreciate it. And just, thanks for joining us. And we look forward to watching where the next few months go for the right in the UK.
Great.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you so
Dan.
much, guys.